Welcome to the deep dive. We sift through different sources to pull out the key ideas for you, the learner, making complex stuff a bit easier to digest.
And today we're looking into Buddhist philosophy, the Dhamma. We've got texts from Buddhadasa Bhikkhu and commentary from Fra Ajahn Jayasaro.
Yeah, our mission basically is to understand what they're saying about Dhamma, how it's seen as, well, scientific, its view on this whole idea of self and what that means for, suffering. So let's just jump in. Have you ever stopped to think if that feeling of, you is actually real? Or is it maybe something we've learned, something that even causes problems?
That's really the core question, isn't it? And Buddhadasa Bhikkhu dives right into that. He argues that real Dhamma, the kind that actually gets rid of suffering, has to be scientific.
Scientific, not philosophical.
Exactly. He sees philosophy as more about assumptions, trying to think your way around suffering, calculating, guessing, but not dealing with the actual thing.
Ah, okay. So philosophy is theory, but Dhamma is experience.
Direct experience. He says, essentially, take the real suffering, put it right in front of you, and just look. No need to calculate.
Just observe it directly. That feels very different. And then he says,
This is science.
right? Now keep on like. What does he mean by calling it science? It's not lab coats and test tubes, presumably.
No. It's about the method. Like science, it's based on direct observation and crucially verifiable results. Suffering isn't just an idea. It's real, something you experience.
Okay.
So the science part is observing that suffering, understanding its causes, seeing the path to end it, and then actually practicing that path to get a real result, the end of suffering.
A tangible change. That's the key. It produces observable results.
That's his argument for why it's scientific. It works, and you can see it work.
Got it. Less abstract thought, more practical process. Now, Fra Ajahn Jayasaro brings in a comparison with Western philosophy.
He does, and he's quite point about it. He suggests Western philosophies often come from the minds of ordinary people. That's the term.
Ordinary people, meaning not enlightened.
Right. Not like the Buddha, who he says understood reality directly.
Yeah.
So the frameworks are built on a different foundation, you could say.
And he gives examples.
Yeah, he mentions thinkers like Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud. Hugely influential, of course.
Absolutely.
But he points out that many of their core ideas were, well, largely superseded within decades, replaced by new theories.
Implying they didn't quite capture something fundamental or lasting.
That seems to be the implication. Their systems had limitations, maybe tied to their specific time or perspective.
Okay, and then he contrasts this with the Buddhist teachings.
Exactly. He highlights their endurance over 2,500 years and makes this pretty striking claim that no scientist has managed to prove the core teachings wrong. Not on a single point.
That is a bold claim, especially with modern science. What's that longevity meant to tell us?
Well, Fra Ajahn Jayasaro seems to suggest it points to the teachings being grounded in a direct understanding of reality itself, something fundamental about existence and the human condition.
So if they accurately describe reality, they should hold up over time.
That's the idea. Their consistency, their resilience against being disproven suggests they tapped into something profoundly true.
He also compares Buddhist thought more specifically, doesn't he, with Aristotle and Descartes?
Yes. He acknowledges Aristotle, finding some common ground in ethics, for example.
Dang.
But he also points out bits of Aristotle that seem, well, unacceptable today. Like his views on natural masters and servants shows how philosophy can be tied to its time.
Reflecting the culture of the era. And Descartes.
With Descartes, he mentions the famous, I think, therefore I exist, but also Descartes' view that animals have no feelings, no sentience, which, again, science has moved far beyond.
Right. So the contrast is between these historically situated views and what he presents as the more, perhaps, timeless perspective of Buddhism.
Exactly. He's arguing for a kind of universality or timelessness in the Buddhist understanding, though he does acknowledge things like reincarnation can be points of discussion or skepticism even within Buddhism.
Which brings us neatly to this core idea of the self, this deeply felt sense of I.
The Santhitiko aspect, the truth we experience directly, we all feel it, right? This me, this sense of myself, my things. It feels utterly fundamental. Like Descartes' cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. It seems self-evident.
It absolutely does. And that's the huge challenge when Buddhism introduces the concept of anatta, no self.
Because it flies in the face of our most immediate experience.
Precisely. Our feeling of self is our everyday santhitiko, our direct truth. So the idea that there isn't a permanent, unchanging self is incredibly counterintuitive.
You can talk about no self all day long.
But you're still operating from that feeling of I. Yeah. Frajan Jayadasara notes that even really smart people find it difficult because that sense of self is just so there. So teaching it isn't straightforward. It often needs a more personal approach.
That's what he suggests. It's not just about intellectual explanation, which leads to this idea of skillful means, or upaya.
Skillful means, like strategies.
Kind of. The sources suggest that Dhamma teachings are tools, strategies designed to help us get to understanding. They aren't necessarily absolute truths in themselves, more like techniques.
Techniques of nature, Buddhadasa calls them.
Exactly. And one key technique for tackling this ingrained sense of self isn't trying to argue it away intellectually, at least not initially.
What then?
It's about directly experiencing the suffering that comes with a feeling of self, shifting the focus.
Okay, how does that work? You focus on the link between I and pain.
Pretty much. The practice involves really noticing when thoughts of I, me, mine arise, allowing them even, and then paying super close attention to the feeling that follows, the unease, the tension, the suffering, the pain.
You observe the connection directly.
Yes. Buddhadasa puts it very powerfully. Every time it arises, it's suffering. It burns.
Wow. So you watch this happen again and again.
Until you get, the word used is fed up, weary of it. You start to see that this self, which feels so essential, is actually the source of the burning.
So you're using one direct experience, the suffering, to undermine another direct experience, the feeling of a solid self.
Exactly. It's like using a realized truth, the pain, to challenge what now seems like a false realized truth, the idea of a permanent I. It's quite clever, really.
Buddhadasa has that line, every arising is suffering. And arising here means?
The arising of the sense of self, that moment of I am this or this is mine. And he notes the stronger the ego, the stronger the suffering.
More intense the burn.
Right. And this whole practice, this deep looking into the suffering caused by the illusion of self.
That connects to vipassana, insight meditation.
That's the connection Buddhadasa makes. Vipassana isn't just about feeling calm. It's about gaining this profound, direct insight into how our minds create suffering, especially through this attachment to self.
Okay, so let's sort of wrap this up. What are the main threads we've pulled?
Well, first, true Dhamma is presented not as just philosophy, but as a kind of science of experience, focused on observing and ending real suffering.
Right, very practical, very direct.
Yeah.
Contrasted with philosophical speculation.
Second, the Buddha's teachings are portrayed as incredibly enduring, maybe because they align with fundamental reality, unlike some Western systems that evolved or were replaced.
A claim of timelessness, almost.
And third, this really deep-seated feeling of self, while seeming obvious, is pinpointed as a major root of suffering.
And the path isn't just thinking about no self, but directly seeing the link between self and suffering through practices like vipassana.
Exactly, using experience to transform experience.
So for you listening, hopefully this deep dive gives you a clearer picture of these quite complex ideas, maybe a new way to look at your own sense of self and how suffering works in your life.
Yeah, it offers a different lens, definitely.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with. If that feeling of I, that ego, really is a primary engine of our suffering, what could actually change if that feeling started to loosen up a bit?
What might open up if that grip wasn't quite so tight? Something to ponder.